Also important to point out that AlphaTauri actually just was passed by Williams in the constructors based on Alex Albon's performance. Lawrence, you mentioned he was a former teammate of Max Verstappen. Can we please talk about what a great weekend he had for Team Williams? Obviously, qualifying, they took a huge risk going into Q2, coming out on slicks when he thought that the track was drying up, and then that turned out to be the rule of thumb for everybody. Everybody was trying to go back in and change the tires a little too late for some, Sergio Perez being one. Gets the race done, gets into Q3, and then he's able to finish on the points on one set of tires that at the end of the race, you thought, is he even going to make it? And he was able to do so. Just, can you characterize the drive, the weekend from Alex Albon, and if he's one of the more underrated drivers on the grid at this point?
I think the most impressive thing about that weekend is that it was one of the rare tracks that actually kind of suits the Williams relative to the other teams. And that's because that car doesn't have a huge amount of downforce. I don't know if they were embarrassed, but there was photos of the floor of that car when it got lifted up in Spain, and it looked very basic.
Yeah. We remember.
Yeah.
We talked about it, didn't we?
Of the Red Bull and the Mercedes, and now we've seen bits of the Ferrari as well. And so that car doesn't have a huge amount of downforce, but it is quite good in a straight line. It is quite fast in a straight line. So you look at the layout of the Montreal circuit, and it's one which will suit it. Now, what makes that more impressive, though, is that there was a lot of pressure then to perform. Just as we talk about, Checo under pressure and other drivers under pressure, this was Williams' it's a really good chance, really good opportunity to get points. And they took a risk in qualifying, but a risk that was absolutely worth taking, because in a normal course of events, dry qualifying, they might hope to, again, track that suits them. Maybe they'll get like 14th, 13th tops. But all of a sudden, there was a route into Q3. They took it, absolutely executed it perfectly. Let's not take anything away from that lap either. He was on the right tires at the right time, but it was a very good, clean lap in still tricky conditions, despite being on the correct tires at that very moment. And then from there, it was really a case of what could they do in the race. And there was that early safety car, and then the opportunity to pit. They took it. But for most teams that then put them onto a two-stop strategy, Williams decided they were going to one-stop it, and that required an awfully long stint on a single set of tires. And we've seen Alex do that before. He did it in Australia last year, I think. And it is a real skill, because one, you've got to manage your performance. You can't just drive flat out. A lot of these drivers are very good at going fast, but to kind of get enough performance out of the car to remain ahead whilst still looking after those tires is a real balancing act, a real serious balancing act. And then do it with pressure from behind, DRS zones, and the rest of it. And again, he complimented the car. He said, well, the car's very good in the straight line, which helps. But it was a massively skillful performance, and further proof that Alex is an incredibly good driver. But we have known that for some time. And the question mark has always been after his year at Red Bull, where the pressure, or a year and a half it was at Red Bull, where the pressure clearly started to get to him towards the end. But he was a very young driver back then. He got given an opportunity that I don't think he'd expected to have at that stage of his career. In fact, it wasn't, if you go back just a couple of years before that, he didn't even look like he was going to make F1. He'd signed a deal to race in Formula E before he got the call up from Toro Rosso when they basically ran out of drivers. So that all came around a bit quick, and now we're seeing a very mature, talented driver in Alex, and kind of doing similar things to what we saw George Russell do when he was at Williams. So there's a possibility there, I think, that if a team is looking, if they need a driver, a capable driver, fast driver, then they'll start to look to Alex. Nate and I were talking about this earlier. He has a very rock solid contract, it seems, at Williams. But the contracts come to an end, and eventually either he'll look to see what Williams are offering him, whether they can actually move further up the grid. Obviously, James Vowles has some big plans for there, but every time you talk to James, it's always give us 2 years, give us 3 years, because there's a lot we need to change. Or whether he'll be able to fast route himself up with an offer from a big team. But he's certainly doing all the right things for either of those circumstances to come true.
Yeah, he was definitely a bright spot on the weekend. Unfortunately for his teammate, Logan Sargeant, his race ended as quickly as it seemed to begin. There was mechanical issues, car issue on lap 8. And so he was forced to retire. We've been somewhat critical of him in the past. Obviously, this race, don't feel like you can put the onus on him for, the car failing him in that moment. But Nate, how would you describe, Logan Sargeant's future moving forward? I know that Mick Schumacher is currently with Mercedes, but it seems like he's waiting in the wings for an opportunity to open up anywhere.
Yeah, and it's worth saying Logan also didn't have the upgrade. So, Albon had an upgraded car. Sargeant didn't have that. It was tough actually to watch the weekend from Sargeant's perspective, because on Thursday he was pretty honest actually. He said, I need to do better. I know I've been underperforming, and it's actually not that often you see drivers, especially at that age, be that candid. They can be very, very guarded. So I was actually quite impressed that he would say that to the media, because he knew that was going to be a headline. Williams would have said to him, if you say this will be a headline. And then for him to maybe not have the clean weekend to maybe show that, I think he's hoping to get the upgrades in Austria. I don't know with Sargeant. I mean, I think Lawrence said this well on a few shows ago. When you're a rookie, you come in. I mean, what have we had? 8 races, I think, so far. 8. Is it 8 or 9? 8. I can't do my maths off the top of my head, but I think it's 8. I keep losing. Yeah, I keep losing track with there's been some cancelled. There's been all that stuff. But he's still fairly new into his Formula One career, and the Mick Schumacher thing I think is interesting, because I just never got the feeling that Mick Schumacher was that impressive when he was at Haas. If you take away those 2 races where he scored points, he caused a lot of damage to the Haas team. In terms of the car, he was crashing quite a lot. I don't know whether that would be an upgrade. I think that Schumacher brought with him quite a bit of baggage behind the scenes. I think he was fine, but some of the people with him certainly gave Haas a headache. You don't get that impression with Sargeant. Sargeant's fit very well into that team, and I think that Williams, especially with Val's there, but historically have been very good with young drivers. But I think it's been a two-way street. They've had drivers who fit in there well, and don't really cause a huge issue. I mean, I know that kind of Latifi became a bit of a meme by the end of his career, but you never got the impression that people didn't like working with him there. He might not have been the quickest driver, but he fit in, and obviously he was bringing money with him as well. So I don't know whether Sargeant is imminently in danger from Schumacher. I'm sure that Toto Wolff would want him to get that seat. But to me, when I saw the news, I don't think it would be an upgrade. I don't think we've seen enough from Sargeant just yet to say Schumacher's better than him. He certainly hasn't had the accidents that Schumacher had at this point. He's had a few offs, but he's not had anything. Schumacher, I think it was last year for the first 6 months, he was putting the car in the wall, like, it seemed like every few weekends. Sargeant hasn't done that yet. I think his biggest issue, obviously he went off in Spain, his biggest issue has more just been maybe the pace hasn't been there. There's been a few little mistakes and stuff like that. But I think if you're Williams, you want to give him a few more months, and you want to see the drive you've got by the end of the year. Because I don't think really dropping someone in the middle of the season is going to do Schumacher any good. Let's say that Schumacher, is in the frame. And it's also, obviously, it's not going to do Sargeant any good. You just get rid of him halfway through the year. He'll say, well, I never had a chance to prove myself. Never gave me a full year.
Fair.
And Schumacher, let's not forget, Schumacher had 2 seasons. He didn't just have one. He had one in a very bad Haas car. Then he had one when the car was better last year. I don't know, really. I always say it, but I think if Mick Schumacher's name was Mick Fischer or Mick, pick any other German surname you can think of, I don't know whether people would really be that convinced that he deserves to drive anywhere on the grid. I just don't think his time in Formula One really proved that. And that's coming from someone who grew up as a Schumacher fan. I wanted him in the on the grid as much as anyone. But yeah, if it's a direct comparison between those two, I would definitely stick rather than twist. But Williams might look at it differently. But I don't think he's bringing more to the team than Sargeant does currently.
Also, Sargeant, Williams invested quite a lot in Sargeant's career already. They basically funded his F2 career, and to just write that off after 8 races seems like a very strange,
harsh
business decision. Yeah, and as you say, I mean, look, if the other option was like Max Verstappen, sure, okay, obviously you're going to stick him in, but the other option is Mick Schumacher, and for all the reasons that Nate said, he didn't do enough to impress last year, and suggest that he's the right option. And at the moment, Williams, they need results like they had in Canada from Alex. They need results where they're going to, just scrape a few points here and there, get themselves off the foot of the Constructors' Championship, get a few more million in the bank. It's very much a long-term process, and just chopping between drivers at this stage isn't going to help with the development of the car. It isn't going to help with anything, really. It's not going to help with morale within the team. So I just don't see a situation where it would make any sense to do that. And it's very easy to say, isn't it? Look, swap drivers around mid-season, but it's so much harder for the driver coming in than you might imagine, because with no testing and getting to know even just understanding what every button does on the steering wheel is not an easy thing to do within the space of a couple of races. So you're potentially throwing away a couple of opportunities there, and it just doesn't make any sense to me. Longer term, maybe, maybe it could be an option if Mick Schumacher comes with some funding for 2024, 2025, and Logan can't compete. Maybe, sure, then you're adding something worthwhile, but mid-season just doesn't make sense to me.
There's go ahead.
Sorry, Katie. I think the Albon equation here is important as well. I think it's a bit, and Lawrence, mentioned with when Russell was there, I don't think any driver really who's available would look good currently against Albon. Albon's performing so well. So it's easy to think, oh, this driver's just rubbish, but it might just be the benchmark they're up against is a bit higher. And then it comes back to exactly what Lawrence was saying. So many reasons to just not get rid of someone. But I think whoever you put in there right now, if it's Schumacher, whoever it is, Albon's going to be the better guy.
I was just going to say that you put a premium on continuity in this sport, certainly. And I think, as Lawrence had mentioned, if you append that at this moment, you wouldn't have the continuity to be able to progress.
And just on Albon, I think it's worth us saying, because I'm so impressed with him currently. And I know there was certainly a desire last year within his camp to see if he could get out of that contract. Not saying he wanted to get out of it desperately, but I think he recognized that there was an opportunity to move around the grid, and there was definitely interest in him. And I think that going forward, we talked about Ricciardo earlier. If I was predicting anything now, I would say, let's say we do get a year where Danny Ric ends up in AlphaTauri and Albon is still doing this at Williams next season. He's not affiliated with Red Bull anymore, but I think Albon going back to Red Bull, I think, is just as likely as Ricciardo. It was very telling. Christian Horner, every interview he did on Sunday, with all the different broadcasters, he just out of nowhere would say, I have to say as well, great drive from Alex. Obviously, there's a former link there, but it's not a link that exists currently. So I think Red Bull, and on Albon as well, when everyone says Albon and Gasly together both didn't compete against Verstappen, which is true. When Gasly left, you got the impression it was his fault from the team. They said Gasly didn't really fit in well here. He didn't really listen to feedback, etc. That was kind of the rap on him. With Albon, you could tell that Red Bull kind of wanted it to work. And the only reason really in the end it didn't was because they realized going into 21, we need a competitive second driver. And they had Sergio Perez available. And they said, we're not going to get a driver this competitive, this well-rounded, this experience. And Albon hadn't quite done enough to kind of keep that seat. But I think when he left, there was an understanding that we probably didn't do fully right by him either. That's why Red Bull kind of did keep him around. So Albon's actually a really interesting character going forward, I think, in the driver market, because a lot of teams are probably looking at him right now and saying that guy is super, super fast. And, like Lawrence mentioned, that's not an easy drive to do what he did at the weekend. So, I think he's going to be a name we're talking about a lot more like in the next year or so, just because, and that contract does, I said to Lawrence earlier, it seems like it's made from cement from everything I've heard from it. It's very difficult to get out of. But if he can get out of it, and or if he's just able to, obviously to leave at the end of next year, I think he'll go somewhere pretty good.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.